Yes, LidStar is definitely my favorite product that we make. So about me and about Glacier. Some of us have heard of Glacier before, some of us haven't. We are a skin-first beauty e-commerce company. And some of us have spoken at past Spree and Solidus conferences throughout the years. For my specific day-to-day, what I actually do is I spend most of my time making internal tooling somewhat wonderful for the company. However, I've worked kind of across all teams at Glacier, so if anyone wants to talk about Glacier or loves to talk about Glacier, we have many fans out there. Feel free to grab me whenever. I get this actually a lot. I've actually never done a tech talk at a Solidus or a Spree conference ever. I kind of always do soft talks. And my answer why I don't do tech talks is usually terrible. They involve like sidestepping and like saying I only do them for like little meetups and stuff, small regional conferences. However, this year I actually have a really good excuse. And I've been mostly in JavaScript for the last year and a half. Mostly in GraphQL and mostly in like federated services. So all of that kind of enforces or informs kind of the rest of this talk. But before that, let's do a little history. So a few years ago, I was up on the stage, much like this, in front of many of you, actually, and talking about how to inject empathy in REST APIs. I ended that talk with a hypothesis that GraphQL could be a more empathic API interface. Skipping ahead a few years, last year, I kind of did a follow-up here, and I said that, however, like REST, GraphQL, the technology itself wasn't the path to empathy. Ultimately, I found that there was a single truth that ran between both of these talks. And that was the fact that empathic solutions stemmed really from the team implementing the features and not so much the technology. So with kind of all of that out of the way, what on earth could I talk about this year? And some of these topics actually have been already mentioned, which I think is amazing. This is my new favorite one. Actually, no, this is my new favorite one. Yeah, or maybe that one. So with everyone probably on their edge of their seat, this year's talk is, yes, try not to be afraid. So I'm going to start with like the emotional intelligence end of this, mainly because I find it to be the hardest to kind of understand. And then we'll move slowly into how emotional intelligence and like these 5 factors of emotional intelligence can be mapped into a team beginning their microservice journey. So starting with emotional intelligence, it starts with this man right here. His name's Daniel Goleman. In his book in 1999, or the 90s basically, he wrote, the book was called Why It Can Matter, and why EQ is more important than IQ. Daniel basically split the brain into 2 different forms. One driven by pure logic, which many of us likely use day in and day out. And the other one aiding in humans as their like instinctive feeling side. So kind of like a cool dual-edged brain. So the term emotional intelligence, what he kind of codified in that book, is really here. So it's the capability of individuals to recognize their own emotions and those of others, discerning between different feelings and labeling them appropriately. So you use emotional intelligence to guide thinking and behavior and manage or adjust emotions to adapt to environments or achieve one's goals. And a lot of what this talk is kind of that last sentence there, is to try to achieve your goals. So this all starts in 5 parts, like I mentioned. Each one is like a distinct camp of emotional intelligence with its own rules, its own strengths and weaknesses. And so let's take some time to go over each 5 items and then move into microservices. So the first one is self-awareness. This shows itself in people where they understand their emotions. And that will kind of, I mean, obviously that will be an underlying topic of the entire talk, is understanding your emotions. They also don't allow these emotions, or these people don't allow these emotions to control or direct them. Due to this, these people tend to embody a lot of self-confidence, but they also have high awareness of themselves and high understanding of other people's emotions as well. So the second is self-regulation. This would be team members who embody, or team members who are folks who are active thinkers. They think way before they make any decisions. And due to this, they tend not to get too jealous or too angry. And these people oftentimes relish in their even keelness. So these people would be maybe what I would consider nonplussed most of the day. The third being motivation. Motivated people, like, we know what motivation looks like. They take challenges head on. For engineers, this is the easiest part of emotional intelligence to understand, again, in my humble opinion. People who are motivated are oftentimes highly productive and almost are always reaching for spaces to trade immediate gratification for long-term successes. The one that I've kind of focused on mainly for the last 2 or 3 years is empathy. I've spoken about this, like I said, at numerous conference talks. However, for those people who've missed them, empathy is usually considered the superhuman ability of emotional intelligence. It's the ability to recognize the needs and emotions of the folks around you. These people are quick to manage relations, they listen super well, and they relate to others in a very almost instant way. So a good member of your team might look like someone who's always welcoming, someone who asks questions before makes statements in code reviews, and is generally maybe extremely well adept at asynchronous communication. And last but not least is the most important one, I think, out of the 5, and that is social skills. So these are the folks who master building relationships. They're oftentimes people are oftentimes considered highly emotionally intelligent, but also this kind of extends beyond the true idea of social skills. So how do people respond? A good example is smiling at someone, so they smile back, so you know that person feels good, because usually when humans smile, you get a shot of dopamine. So it's this kind of almost mastery of being able to manipulate. Again, I don't like that word, but that is a way of looking at it, manipulate other people's emotions. But what about microservices? Now that everyone has a good baseline idea of what makes up emotional intelligence, how may we take these 5 parts and gauge if a team is ready to take on a monolith and break it down into services? Before we directly answer that question, let's turn our gaze towards what a monolith is really. These are oftentimes easy to implement. They're easy to end-to-end test, which is why they're so popular, I think. The Majestic monolith is always a wonderful starting point for any company, so they're great for startups. They tend to be easy to load balance and therefore scale almost unlimited. Just throw it behind a load balancer, basically. We all know what a monolith looks like, right? Because we're used to Solidus, we're used to Spree. A lot of times this has been criticized of the Rails community in general. And all of us have been in both of those communities, or most of us have been in both of those communities for quite some time. So this is what they normally look like. Rough diagram, if everyone likes diagrams. Way cut off. Moving from this monolith to microservices-like structure isn't something that we should be just doing whenever, right? The idea is don't read a Medium article and immediately bring up a roadmap to change to microservices. It really takes kind of a team that's ready for this before actually implementing it. And a natural question might be this right here. So as of maybe 5 years ago, it was very in vogue to rewrite entire systems onto new platforms. So be that Rails 5 to Rails 6, or even Spree and Solidus jumping versions. This was super in vogue. I don't think that this is quite there anymore. I haven't seen it in maybe 2 or 3 years, really because it's actually a really scary thing to do. It's very scary to just port all of your data onto a brand new system and just throw it out into the wild. Yes, if some of us have blue-green deploys, we can kind of roll back easily, but even so, it's not easy. So what could be a less stressful idea? Martin Fowler is probably one of the more famous people who are talking about microservices over the last like probably 3 to 4 years. And he said this in a quote on his blog post entitled Monolith First. And basically it's saying, build your monolith first, figure out the pain points, and then figure out where the seams are in this monolith to break them up into microservices. And again, like that's really what this talk is going into right now, is like, what are the seams for your microservice, and how can you gauge if your team is ready for it? So yeah, how do these things intersect emotional intelligence? This was written in 1975. I think most people know what this book is. But Fred Brooks happened to quote a paper by Melvin Conway, therefore kind of like codifying Conway's quote into a law. But anyway, in the paper, Conway expressed the following thesis about teams. It reads, any organization that designs a system defined more broadly here than just information systems will inevitably produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. So this is a big, big thing, and a huge, if you kind of look at sort of the idea of teams as a whole, teams will 99% of the time do exactly this. So again, the rest of the talk is kind of like helping you and your team to be able to move to a microservice type architecture in a very slow and thoughtful way. So a good question of monoliths is who owns what? Blurred lines of ownership across teams in monolith can lead to some interesting cross-team dynamics in general. Without clear boundaries offered by microservices, it's easy for teams to step on other teams' toes. They find themselves building features without clear decision-making and ultimately stagnating without hope of a production deploy. This isn't a huge part of successful team ownership. Teams that don't trust each other, though, tend to kind of exhibit this who owns what idea. So with less trust in a team has, the more blurred these lines of ownership become. Increasing trust doesn't come overnight, but oftentimes it can be addressed in how vulnerable each person on the team is willing to be with everyone else on the team. So a good example of this would be like the self-awareness cue, right? Each member, no matter how they feel, like maybe they've taken assessments or not, but things like DISC and other like behavioral assessments can really help strengthen each team member and moreover be able to express how they deal with their own strengths and weaknesses to other people on the team. So a good idea is like if your team has this sort of mentality, this is a good step towards microservices. Number 2 would be finding the seams. We've already talked about seams during this conversation, or during this conference, sorry. Slicing away the first microservice might be the hardest part of moving to a microservices-based approach. Too often, folks reach for the most painful or most sticky items that are causing issues. And we oftentimes reach for empathy here. We'll jump into Slack channels, and we'll look for our deploy channel and see how people are feeling, right? I think there's a little bit of like a more concrete thing, or a concrete piece of EQ here that's worthwhile, and that would be social skills. And an active project that's usually done before you split up into microservices or begin the process of splitting up into microservices is this thing called event storming. Has anyone done any event storming before? Yes. What it is its methodology involves discovering key domain objects and plotting them along a time series. So not super hard. Usually it's done with a bunch of stickies. What's cool is this is an integral part of domain-driven design. And event storming can't work without utilizing key domain experts basically across the organization. One of the key takeaways of this sort of game or whatnot is almost this idea of like modeling processes, both now and future processes that the business relies on. So it's a good way to like kind of unearth the processes that a monolith oftentimes hides. And none of this is possible without the convergence of domain experts and effective social skills during those event storming sessions. Yes, third one. Is decoupling. Interfaces are a natural move to reduce coupling, and oftentimes the best way to do this is to use a term known as outside-in thinking. This means that we think of solutions from the point of the consumer first and not us as the implementer. And then afterwards we work sort of backwards to actually implement the API. this is one of this sort of idea of outside-in thinking was the kind of crux of my first SolidusConf talk on empathy in APIs. And if we think about this just like from the descriptions of the 5 elements of emotional intelligence, this really lands with empathy, right? You're thinking from a consumer, you're thinking about everyone else who's consuming your API or your seams or your layers, and building something in return of that. Intel's CEO, Andy Grove, was like the master of outside-in thinking. He sadly isn't with us anymore, but he was known for pushing Intel's management to constantly be anticipating corporate landscape changes. And the result of this was Intel pivoted somewhat early on in their lifestyle from the idea of memory storage to semiconductors. And we know the story of Intel after that. When designing interfaces for your first or next microservice, be thinking about the API. From a customer's perspective, like noodle on what information should be pushed away from the consumer. Don't only focus on maybe the response and the request, but actually like the underlying implementation of the API itself. And maybe like changing the landscape like this, we can change the landscape of our API like Andy Grove did with Intel all those years ago. Another like great thing to look at when it comes to breaking up monoliths into smaller pieces is the freedom of languages. There's a large ecosystem of languages out there, and when the idea of microservices sort of begins to entrench themselves into your organization, every developer on your team is going to want to write the next microservice in Rust or Elm. That's a guarantee. That's 100% will happen. And because of this, team members and team leaders really should express some self-regulation along the way. Understanding that team churn is actually a very real thing in an organization and is something that all of us deal with. Being conservative with your first service, especially around the language, is something that should keep top of mind. Look for languages that everyone on the team is good at. We mentioned it this morning, sometimes teams are small, and sometimes the language that bridges everyone is JavaScript. Okay, so that is your choice, JavaScript right there. Saying that though, be cognitive of the team itself, the current team and emerging languages. Microservices should be small, right? Like they should be in a space where if a service is constrained, you should be able to reproduce it easily in Rust in a few days or weeks. There's actually another kind of like flip side to this freedom of languages, and that doesn't really rely on self-regulation. It actually relies on motivation. So the opposite would be, hey, you're not self-regulating your team, you're actually creeping on your team. Like, do they have public repositories on GitHub and GitLab? Are they actively doing development in these languages, maybe later at night or outside business hours? Those are the people you really want to like take by the arm and say like, hey, if we were to split out our fulfillment service into a microservice, what would it look like? What would you choose and why? So this is a kind of like other end of the card. Lastly, there's like 7 of these, so sorry about there being no numbers. We're almost there. So a good question is like package all the things. Like how many people are deploying packages every day? Like how many people have access to Gem Theory or GitHub, Ruby Gems? Like are you pushing tag dependencies to these places every day? If you are, that's great. That is a great marker for a team that is ready to go to some type of microservices architecture. The idea there is that the team is motivated, just like we talked about before, in the space, and they understand package maintainership. We know this is tricky and hard. They understand versioning. They might be the first people who are like looking to have access to GitHub or GitLab registries so they can publish internally without going through Ruby Gems or NPM, which is kind of a terror show these days. So if they definitely if your team definitely has the motivation to do this and the expertise, lean on that. But if not, know that this is kind of a bit of the secret sauce when it comes to successful breaking up of microservices, like breaking up a monolith into microservices, and find ways to inform and educate your team how to do this. Like this is the easiest way to inform and educate a team. Second to last, I promise. In many scenarios, an application is reliant on constant DB to DB connections to manage interactions through a single monolithic app. This isn't and shouldn't be the case when switching to microservices. Any new service will talk to any other service through an API layer. That API layer could be GraphQL, it could be REST, protobuf, whatever. Regardless, there won't be any DB connections shared. So how does a team currently document their own API layers? Moving to microservices, you will have a proliferation of API layers. And how documentation is kind of structured currently at an organization will kind of dictate how documentation rolls over into a microservices-based space. This could fall under empathy, but again, I think this is more of like a social skills space. Building useful documentation and useful technical documentation specifically is mainly centered around communication. It's sharing your intent of your service API layer, and that's not trivial. This coupled with understanding how your users will consume your documentation, also kind of empathic, but being able to propose edits, being open for edits, and even knowing how edits kind of flow through the system are all integral when dealing with documentation. Last one, I promise, and probably something that I don't really believe in. I don't believe in 100% test coverage. I think it's meaningless and it's hard to get to. But it is a good space, especially 100% integration or feature tests. Like if you have these for an existing monolith, then you have a well-groomed test suite that can support the move to maybe a microservice-based space. And the cool part is tests intersect all 5 sections of emotional intelligence. So running down the space here, self-awareness, developers need to take stock of how they feel when they run a single file in the test suite or the whole suite. Is it just a massive pain? Do the tests not function without connection to the internet? Like, is there just a myriad of issues in the suite itself? Self-regulations, developers make rational choices around the information from the pain from the test suite or just failed builds in general. With social skills, like are developers talking about failed tests? How do they successfully fix failed builds, like ghost tests and stuff like this? Is talking about tests sort of like what everyone's doing around maybe some lunch breaks, not all? With empathy, like how can you strive to better understand how these slow tests affect everyone else on the team? And finally, with motivation, it's like who's taking the initiative to fix these tests? So tests in general are a great thing, we know it, and they are a wonderful space to really judge and see if a team is ready to move to a microservice-based approach. And with that, and with those coughs, I love it, that's really it. This is kind of the web where you can find me. Obviously on GitHub at that handle, my Twitter and Mastodon if people are Mastodon users. My DMs on both platforms are always open, and whenever you feel comfortable to reach out, simply do. More than anything, I'd love to thank Glacier for all they do for the Ruby-based e-commerce space. With Solidus and then Spree, there's so much going on with the space, and Glacier is excited to be a part of it for the foreseeable future. I tend not to leave a talk like this without some sort of links to help everyone out. I will publish this and then publish this in the Slack channel. But if you're looking for some good books on EQ, I would recommend staying within the book realm. Medium is a great place to find how to do a create React app, but it's not great when it comes to sort of like judging well-documented, well-founded EQ articles. With microservices, we talked very briefly about Martin Fowler. His blog is kind of a wonderful treasure trove of space for this. Also Sam Newman, he wrote the original sort of microservices book back in 2015, I believe. He has amazing talks on just all of this. A lot of this underlying microservices ideas are from him. And that book itself is being rewritten for 2019-2020, so it's going to be super updated. So please do this. And everyone else who's sort of seen one of my talks knows that I like to leave the community with something to think about relatively for the next year, because sometimes I'm busy. But who knows who this person is? Yes. This is Toby Lutke, and he owns a little startup called Shopify. Also, who knows what this is? Okay, maybe a little bit different. If you played with Fast Ruby before a few months ago, it's now no longer available. It was a very accessible way to write Ruby, or, and this is, I think, the bigger thing, Crystal functions that were extremely easily just deployed and ran on demand. Very much like what Zeit is for JavaScript functions as a service, or even Heroku is for more traditional Ruby apps. So with those two, as of a few days ago, Toby mentioned this on Twitter. Big things are happening in this space. Shopify is looking to further break up their monolith. We know they're doing it already into like manageable chunks. Yeah, I'm excited for this and excited for where this means for Ruby, for Crystal, for languages that look like Ruby. And with that, yes, any questions? It's kind of a whirlwind tour. Microservices are kind of a weird thing. If you have any questions or you want to kind of like talk about where and how Glace is moving to microservices, feel free to reach out after this. Thanks.